Good afternoon. Nice to see some of you here despite other things being on people's minds probably these days. My name is Arne Hinz. I'm from the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff University, and I'm the principal investigator of the project Digital Citizenship and Surveillance Society. 3 years ago, Edward Snowden leaked secret information about surveillance programs by the NSA primarily, to journalists, and his revelations started to appear in newspapers like The Guardian. We learned about how our data is intercepted, collected, and analyzed, and how our communication is monitored. We also learned about programs of breaking encryption, hacking into servers, manipulating information. And we learned about the leading role of the British GCHQ in all this. In Snowden's words, quote, "The Brits are doing what even the Americans wouldn't do." This has led to debates and controversies around the nature of civil rights in the context of security. It has led to some public protest, conflicts between the state and internet companies recently, especially, and calls for policy reform. And all this has taken place in a complex, multifaceted environment. An environment of, yes, war and terror in this part of the world, most recently with the Paris attacks and others, but also, on the other side, the rollback of civil rights. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recently observed about the current state of the world, quote, "Clampdowns on public freedoms and crackdowns on civil society activists and human rights defenders are hacking away at the forces which uphold the healthy function of societies. Barriers of suspicion are rising, sneaking through and between our societies." And as many scholars have observed, both governmental strategies and public debate around the world are increasingly driven by processes of securitization. But there's also a particular media and technology context. We increasingly interact with our social and political environment through digital media. Digital tools and platforms are increasingly essential for us to participate in society, from social media chats to online banking to online voting to digital protest. We increasingly enter the sphere of civic activity and develop agency through digital media, which means we are becoming digital citizens. And this has created great opportunities. Scholars have discussed the democratizing effect of what some have called liberation technology, the role of social media in political change, citizen journalism, and so on. But the flip side is that these technologies have allowed unprecedented levels of surveillance and monitoring, which can be a major limitation to our practice of digital citizenship, as it basically also eliminates the possibility of confidential and private communication. And, well, it is a limitation to our rights, such as the right to freedom of expression. Moreover, that monitoring is now done by both the state and the companies that provide the infrastructure for digital citizenship, devices, platforms, and so on, to extract and use our data in profitable ways, which is why our contemporary social and economic order has been described as one of surveillance capitalism. And so in the context of all this, we started a research project in the autumn of 2014, a while ago, almost 2 years ago, to investigate the implications of the Snowden revelations for 4 areas of digital citizenship: news media, civil society, policy, and technology. And we figured these areas would be relevant as digital citizenship requires few things. It requires public knowledge of the characteristics and opportunities and challenges of technological infrastructure. It requires the possibility to enact digital citizenship without fear and repercussions. It requires a clear legal and regulatory framework that protects and enhances digital citizenship. And it requires the security of and perhaps trust in the infrastructure. Now, the project has been funded by the UK Economics and Social Research Council, ESRC, and hosted by Cardiff University. And the project team has included investigators from 3 different universities and several research associates and research assistants, whose names you can read here on the slide. We also have an advisory board of both academic and non-academic experts. Again, you can read their names here. A couple of them are here now. What we also did, we had actually a big conference, a major international conference last year at Cardiff University, and several of the investigators spoke at events in many countries on our research and on the research results. So now we have completed our work, completed our research, and we're working on academic publications, including 2 special issues of academic journals, and a few other publications that are about to come out. And so what we want to do here today is to briefly present some of these outcomes, some outcomes of our research, a few snapshots perhaps, a few highlights. And after that, we'll have 4 workshops in which we want to hear from you and discuss with you, well, what are the issues that are addressed in our research and what are the implications of that for research, for academia, for practice, for advocacy, for policymaking, and so on. And this is basically an outline of the plan for today. Downstairs in the registration area, there are also A4 printouts of that. I hope you found those. And yes, this is the plan for today. Okay? Everyone clear what we're going to do? So let's finally get to the actual research results, or the snapshots and outline summaries of what we did. And so for a brief overview of the first of these 4 themes, journalism and news media, I would now like to ask Professor Karin Wahl-Jørgensen to tell us more about that.
Thank you, Arne, and thank you all very much for coming along this afternoon. And I am here, as Arne said, to talk about the research in the media strand of this project. And this research focused on 2 main areas. First of all, looking at how have the British news media represented the Snowden leaks and digital surveillance more broadly, and then secondly, how have journalists themselves responded to the events following the Snowden leaks, in particular with regards to press freedom and to the handling of security-related information. So just to give you a brief overview of some of the research we've actually done to investigate these questions, we have first of all looked at the media coverage of the Snowden revelations and a series of subsequent case studies through a content analysis. And the case studies that we looked at were based on peaks in coverage. So we looked at case studies including, first of all, the initial revelations, also coverage of the spying on foreign embassies and world leaders, the detention of Glenn Greenwald, and the parliamentary report on the Lee Rigby murder, and finally the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the questions around encryption and the revival of the Snoopers Charter that that's raised. Now, we did this content analysis by looking at both newspapers and blogs, a larger sample of newspaper stories and blog stories, and then we also carried out a series of interviews with journalists who have actually covered topics relevant to surveillance, predominantly newspaper journalists, but also some broadcast journalists. And just to give you a preview of our findings, in terms of the media coverage, what we found there is that the media coverage in mainstream media, that is particularly in newspapers, tends to normalize and contribute to the justification of surveillance, even though this is being contested somewhat in terms of how blogs tend to report on surveillance. But very interestingly, what we also found was that actually when we interviewed the journalists covering these stories, we found them to be very critical of these practices of surveillance, particularly of mass surveillance. And I'm going to go into some of these findings very, very briefly now. So first of all, one of the things that we were interested in investigating is what are the most frequent opinions about surveillance that are being heard in the media. And what we found there was a very striking disparity between the opinions towards surveillance. if we compare newspapers and blogs. So in our newspaper sample, the most frequently expressed view was that surveillance actually should be increased or is acceptable and necessary. This was reflective of 9% of opinions. And sources that express this view tended to suggest that surveillance is crucial to national security and particularly important to strengthen in the light of a perceived terrorist threat. By contrast, the views that were expressed most frequently in the blog sample were far more likely to raise a viewpoint that surveillance should be reduced or is unacceptable and illegal, and that intelligence services should be more transparent and accountable. And these blogs were also more likely to raise questions about individual rights and liberties that were at the heart of Snowden's revelations. We also examined who was identified as the targets of surveillance in blog and newspaper coverage. And here what we found was that newspapers tended to position foreign politicians, world leaders, and terrorists as the primary targets of surveillance, whereas blogs were more preoccupied with the implications of surveillance for the public. In a newspaper sample, the most frequently mentioned targets of surveillance were foreign politicians and world leaders in almost a quarter of cases, followed by terrorists in 23.5% of cases. By contrast, what we see here is that in the blog sample, members of the public were predominantly identified as the targets of surveillance, very much in line with Snowden's concerns. In blogs, members of the public accounted for 43.5% of instances where targets of surveillance were discussed. And this was followed by terrorists in 20.7% of cases, and journalists in 17.9% of the cases, with foreign leaders, foreign politicians and world leaders mentioned in just 11.8% of cases. Now, this is not all that surprising, and our publications go into more detail in talking about this, but what's very clear if you look at who's actually used as the sources, particularly in newspapers, the sources for opinions about surveillance are very predominantly politicians. So politicians account for 40.8% of sources across stories, with journalists being the second most frequent type of source. What that means then is that politicians and their spokespersons are given voice far more frequently than any other source type. And their opinions appear to reflect the preoccupations of governments and intelligence agencies and focus on the implications of the leaks for the sphere of political life rather than for the liberties and rights of individual citizens. Now then, very briefly, I want to discuss by contrast how the journalists who actually covered these surveillance stories talked about surveillance. And we interviewed journalists representing publications from across the political spectrum, as well as tabloids and broadsheets, and also some broadcast journalists. And what's interesting to note here is that journalists themselves were highly critical of surveillance. So, for example, journalists expressed awareness of the ways in which terrorist threats are being used to rationalize and increase surveillance, and the ways in which surveillance represents an abuse of power on the part of the intelligence agencies. Journalists also expressed a variety of different opinions about the quality of the coverage of the Snowden revelations and subsequent debates over surveillance. And there was some consensus among them that, in fact, the Snowden revelations and issues around mass surveillance had been covered very patchily. And what they all agreed on was, as a result of the nature of the coverage and the complexity of practices of mass surveillance, there is a very poor public understanding of surveillance and very little understanding of the relationship between the targeted surveillance of terrorist suspects and world leaders and the untargeted mass surveillance of citizens, which was actually very broadly viewed by journalists as being unacceptable. And then finally, journalists themselves were highly aware of surveillance, and a very large number of them felt they had personal experience of being under surveillance. Many of them suspected that their phones had been tapped or they were being followed on a regular basis. They were suggesting that the surveillance of their activities actually has a chilling effect on journalism and might limit press freedom. So just to conclude, our research demonstrated this very striking pattern that mainstream media coverage tends to actually appear to favor views that are supportive of surveillance. And even though that's being contested in blogs, they're clearly less influential in terms of affecting public debate. But what we see by contrast is that journalists themselves are very critical of surveillance. So what seems to be going on is that journalists are complicit with the legitimation of these very surveillance practices that they themselves quite openly criticize. And that ultimately, because this is due to a structural and deeply embedded journalistic practice, which means that sources who are usually very powerful and elite politicians actually are allowed to frame debates over surveillance. And that in turn implies a complicity with the ideological projects of the very institutions that the journalists are supposed to hold accountable. So those are some of the main findings of our media analysis. I'm now going to hand over to it is Dr. Line Bensik from Cardiff University, who is going to talk about the civil society research.
Thank you. Yeah, which follows on quite well from Karen's work on the media coverage. We then looked at, is it this? Yeah. Civil society, what we've termed the civil society workstream, which is a slightly odd way of terming this workstream, but basically, I'll tell you, it consists of two different aspects of this, where we wanted to look at public knowledge and attitudes to digital surveillance and changes in digital communication practices, whether there were forms of self-regulating behavior, so British public in sort of broad term generally, and then the other aspect of it is to look particularly at political activists and the implications or the impact of the Snowden leaks on politically active citizens. And what we did for this, is that we carried out focus groups for the first aspect and the public knowledge aspect. We did focus groups with different demographic groups within the UK, across different geographical regions in the UK, trying to consider questions around socioeconomic status, ethnic background, and age, as well as geographic location. And we did 10 focus groups during the period of between February and August 2015. Where we talked focus groups of around 3 to 8 people in each one. And then we also then, for the second part, the question around the impact on political activists, we did interviews with a range of political activists, both from big NGOs as well as smaller community and grassroots organizations based in the UK. We did 11 groups in total, including organizations like Greenpeace, Stop the War Coalition, the Trade Union Congress, CAGE, and Campaign Against Arms Trade, amongst others. So importantly, these were groups that were not deliberately engaged in digital rights or technology activism, but are involved in sort of broader social justice issues and have more or less adversarial relations with the state. And the people we spoke with weren't specifically people who were responsible for the technical infrastructures of communication, but people who were involved in the organizing more generally. So in these focus groups and in these interviews, we asked about understandings and experiences of surveillance. We talked about knowledge and opinions of the Snowden leaks, attitudes towards intelligence services, questions around online behavior and practices and what changes they might have made, as well as specific responses to the Snowden leaks. So what did we find? First of all, in terms of the focus groups with the British public, these are just some of the things that we'll highlight here, but digital forms of surveillance generally were not particularly salient in how people's initial understandings of surveillance were being discussed, but more sort of visible forms like CCTV cameras would be mentioned more initially. But upon discussion, issues of data collection and so forth didn't necessarily feature that prominently without prompting. But when we started talking about this, it was very clear that discussions of metadata, also in the context of what the UK's Intelligence Oversight Committee has referred to as bulk data collection rather than mass surveillance, that in our focus groups, people felt that the collection of this type of data constitutes surveillance. even though the concept of metadata itself was not widely known or understood, but when examples of geodata or location data was provided, there was a general consensus amongst people that the collection of such data does constitute surveillance. There was a sort of general uncertainty about the workings of the system and concern around this, about not understanding how the operations of surveillance actually work, as well as internal negotiations that go on about the benefits and harms of mass surveillance, which re-emerged again and again in our discussions. And the Snowden leaks haven't necessarily clarified or enhanced understandings of why and how state surveillance is practiced. In fact, we found pretty low knowledge of both Edward Snowden as a person, as well as the content of the Snowden leaks. And in several instances, there was also a significant level of confusion between Snowden and Chelsea Manning, or Julian Assange, and or WikiLeaks. So illustrating also, I think, how whistleblowing around security becomes sort of intertwined in public knowledge. And whilst justification for surveillance was provided in discussions, particularly in relation to terrorism, so justifying surveillance in regard to terrorism, we also actually found a lot of skepticism amongst focus groups participants about the extent and the actual purpose. So questions like, why are they doing this? Why do they need to collect this data? This was also prominent amongst our focus groups, highlighting particularly concerns with implications for privacy, but also with regards to the broader political context in which these practices are being carried out. And this particularly came out in our focus groups with ethnic minorities, who problematized issues around nothing to hide, nothing to fear, much more than we saw in other groups. In terms of actual changes, so there was awareness, but this didn't necessarily translate into active resistance or particular concrete changes in online users, even amongst those who were very critical towards these developments. So for example, with regards to using tools that might circumvent digital surveillance, like encryption and anonymization software, there was very vague awareness among some participants, but very little, if any, uptake of these tools. Predominantly, this was reasoned with questions around convenience and a perceived lack of technical ability, as well as some notion that using encryption means you have something to hide. Rather, we saw that you have a kind of general expectation and normalization that different forms of surveillance has become part of everyday life. So a prominent theme across all our focus groups was a sense of living in a society where there is ubiquitous surveillance, whether that's from corporations, governments, work, peers, and so forth. And therefore people feel a kind of lack of control over what happens to their information and data, with very little power to challenge or change de facto surveillance. And this would sometimes manifest itself in terms of changing things like platform settings, or not wanting to say anything that's too controversial, which also was mentioned in our focus groups, as well as a justification that came out around, well, as long as I have nothing to hide, I probably have nothing to fear, so internalizing this kind of justification. So I think one of the key things we want to highlight with this is that we're talking here about public resignation rather than public consent, in that people do actually have concerns about this, but feel resigned to the fact that these are the practices that are going on. Just then to move on to the interviews with our activist groups. Just some of these themes actually came through also in our interviews with activist groups, particularly around where their police infiltration is much more prominent in how activists speak about surveillance. This has had, I think, much more impact in how understandings of surveillance have come about than digital or invisible forms of surveillance do. But there is also amongst activists, there is a real general awareness and also widespread experiences of surveillance. But actually quite limited knowledge, again, on the Snowden leaks, and again, some confusion with Assange and Chelsea Manning. And actually, because of perhaps this experience or expectation of surveillance, online behavior was very rarely discussed as being directly linked to Snowden, so no direct response to Snowden, although Greenpeace here was the exception, who initially immediately reacted to Snowden. Cage has subsequently changed, but during our interview hadn't done anything yet. But he's here, so you can tell us about that later anyway. And then there is also an idea, therefore, Snowden leaks were unsurprising, and also that somehow if you operate within, some of the organizations said, well, we're too mainstream to really have to worry about this as an issue. So there's an idea that as long as you stay somewhat mainstream, you're kind of safe from concerning yourself with the issue of surveillance. And also reasons for not using encryption. Again, there was questions around convenience and lack of technical ability. But also an interesting theme came out in terms of the fact that some activists view this as being against the rationale of their organization, which strives to be transparent and open and public and inclusive. And by using encryption tool, this somehow strides against this ambition that then you are hiding yourself or you are being exclusive. Only some people can participate in this way. And we also then identified a kind of disconnect here between anti-surveillance resistance being sort of outsourced to technology activists or to digital rights groups, and then these other social justice activists concern themselves with other issues, rather than there being a kind of connection between these issues. There was sort of disconnect. All right, I'll conclude now with this. The last thing, we tried to sort of conceptualize some of this stuff, and we've also in relation to Karin's work stream a bit, that perhaps we can talk about a kind of surveillance realism, where it's, we see that public debate and response and attitudes to mass surveillance in the wake of the Snowden leaks indicates a kind of resignation to surveillance, not meaning that people don't have concerns about it, but that people don't feel empowered to do much about it. There's been a kind of normalization of surveillance. And this also comes to advance these justifications that are then used to negate the evidence of fallacies of the system, like invasion to privacy, into privacy or other types of civic rights. And we see instead that citizens and political activists are continuously negotiating surveillance as a kind of everyday practice where you might do some self-regulating behavior, you might have moments where you're considering this, but not questioning sort of the system overall and resigning to the system overall. Okay, now I hand over to Ian Brown.
I think we'll have to leave the Brexit discussions till later, but obviously they have a particular relevance to surveillance policy. In this work, what I did work with, and thanks also to Anna and to Josh, who's in the audience, and to Joe, who also helped with this policy stream. I think one very simple explanation for some of the findings we already heard about the public's lack of clarity on what is going on in relation to surveillance activities and law and regulation around them is just how mind-bogglingly complex the framework actually is. You know, we were working full-time on it, and that's almost what you need to understand UK alone, let alone then the various layers of the EU, Council of Europe, UN, international laws affecting surveillance. So a big part of the work that we did in the policy stream was simply actually trying to document everything that's come out from Snowden himself, but also as a consequence of Snowden. I mean, he's had, whatever your opinion of his personal motivation or the various impacts of his leaks, he has made, at least temporarily, this whole area much more transparent and open to public democratic discourse, which I certainly, as a Democrat, think is a very positive thing. I think, unfortunately, we don't see much sign of that continuing. We've had this sort of one-off event, and without further similar dumps in future, unfortunately, I haven't got much confidence that this marks a big change. However, as well as documenting all of the institutions involved, various important decisions that have been made by courts and policymakers, the powers that the UK, in particular, intelligence and security agencies have, and those are all on our website. We've put them in what we hope is a user-friendly format that people interested, whether they're journalists or policymakers or members of the public, can work through. But we've also done a series of interviews with different stakeholders that you can see up there, legislators, people from the police and the security agencies, industry, they of course play a huge role when it comes to the internet, digital rights campaigners. So here, as Lena said, Lena focused on non-digital rights campaigners. We talked explicitly to digital rights activists, and also we did one interview with one of the oversight bodies that oversees the use of these intrusive powers. And we hear constant refrains. I've been working on surveillance policy going back to the 90s, and it's interesting actually, one of the conclusions of one of the papers that I've co-authored as a result of this project was, whilst Snowden seemed incredibly revelatory and new, when you look carefully at what he's given us evidence of. Yes, we know a lot more in concrete now about what our, in particular the UK, US and their allies intelligence agencies are doing surveillance-wise. Actually, if you go back to debates in the early 90s, and in particular, which led ultimately to a report by the European Parliament on what one element of the global Five Eyes surveillance system, one of the key names of which was Echelon. You may remember that debate from the late 90s. Actually, what the European Parliament wrote in early 2001, the reason it got very little attention was it was the week before 9/11 happened. There's very little that Snowden has revealed that was not strongly suspected, at the very least. I mean, I actually wrote a paper that was published just a couple of months before the first Snowden leaks. And as those leaks started, I thought, oh my God, have I got this horrendously wrong? And reading Snowden and going back to my own paper, actually, when politicians say, well, Britain already had one of the most transparent legal frameworks in the world, in one sense it did, if you read those laws in the most suspicious way possible. You looked at every vague term and assumed it was exploited to the maximum that it could be. Yes, you could actually see a lot of what Snowden said. The revelations did surprise even me, having been doing that myself for many years. However, we heard with the law that was used in the UK to underpin GCHQ's activities that Snowden revealed, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, that the whole purpose of that act was it set out a clear overarching framework so citizens could go to one place and understand the legal powers used and the justifications and safeguards and so on to put them under surveillance. Actually, we know post-Snowden how false a picture that was. There's a whole jigsaw puzzle of laws going back to the act that privatised British Telecom in 1984, with very broad powers that continue to be used. And we're seeing the same thing with the Investigatory Powers Bill, which is being debated by the House of Lords in 1 hour 20 minutes. Again, the whole point of the IP bill was, as David Anderson called for in his review that was commissioned by the last government, the coalition government, the IP bill again was supposed to set out clearly, transparently in one piece of legislation all of these intrusive powers. But again, we see it's left out whole broad areas. It's making all the same mistakes as RIPA in terms of vague wording, powers that will be left to secret interpretation within the government. So that is rather disappointing. We learned a lot, not just from Snowden, but also activities of digital rights groups, in particular in the UK courts, Privacy International, which brought a number of cases in the Investigatory Powers Tribunal against GCHQ based on evidence from Snowden. Also the Open Rights Group, Javier is here today from ORG, and Big Brother Watch and English Pen, which have an ongoing case in the European Court of Human Rights based again on evidence from Snowden. We've also had a lot of pushback from industry, and that's interesting from a political economy perspective. Of course, different parts of the internet and telecoms industries have different interests here. We now know not just how much cooperation the UK government and intelligence agencies got from the big telecommunications firms, in particular BT, in intercepting all of the traffic flowing through the UK internet cables, but how much money those businesses made from it as well. BT, I think, are paid tens of millions of pounds a year by the UK government to facilitate interception of communications. Of course, the internet, the ISPs, which tend to be, although this is less true than 10 years ago, smaller, the decision makers are more often technologists rather than general managers. Of course, the smaller ISPs were never a state agency, as British Telecom was pre-1984, of course, and some of that persists as well. So the ISPs, and particularly the over-the-top providers, as they're called, the Skypes, Viber, WhatsApp, and so on, although, of course, many of those have now been bought by the global giant internet companies like Microsoft and Facebook, tend to have pushed back harder against these surveillance powers because they perceive it really damages their users' trust in these services and puts people off from using those services. So let me just briefly touch on some of the controversies that are ongoing in these debates. I'm sure you'll hear them in the Lords this afternoon, and we can discuss these further in the workshops this afternoon. So a lot of the controversies actually have come back to basic definitions, and we haven't quite had the time to untangle ourselves how far this is a deliberate diversionary tactic by government officials. But a lot of time is wasted even now, I think, in democratic debate, discourse within debates in the House of Commons, House of Lords, in courts, about very basic topics like what does surveillance mean? You might think that's relatively straightforward, not at all, in policy discussions. So the government argues very strongly that surveillance only refers to the moment when a human being actually looks at intercepted communications or metadata. And of course, one reason they do that is that frames surveillance in a way that it looks like it affects a much smaller number of people. Whereas civil rights activists and technologists tend to say, well, when a computer picks out or selects certain communications as of interest, that's the moment when you can talk about intrusion happening. And that affects much larger numbers of people. That's linked to the issue of bulk collection or mass surveillance, as the two different sides continue to argue about what this means, the collection of very large quantities of communications that are then filtered through, and very small, by contrast, amounts of data pulled out of that very large haystack. Civil society and business have continued to argue against those bulk powers and against preemptive and collection and retention of data, whereas law enforcement and intelligence agencies argue it is absolutely essential to their work. Great ongoing controversy over encryption, which I personally find bizarre. I thought that argument had been settled in the 90s, but we've come back to it again. The law enforcement agencies arguing that it's getting in the way of their access to communications that they legally should be able to have access to, necessary for their work. Linked to that, computer network exploitation, as the government calls it, or hacking, as civil society calls it, about powers of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to break into people's digital devices where they can't access their communications because of encryption in particular. Civil society, you can see the quote there, very concerned about the consequences of those powers. Industry also, because it gives the government very broad powers to require British cybersecurity companies to, in effect, build in backdoors to their products. That's not going to help British technology companies sell their cybersecurity products overseas. And of course, we're not just talking about laptops or even smartphones anymore. The Internet of Things, smart cities, and so on. This is much, much bigger. I've already said a lot of this, and I don't have much time, so we can come back to it this afternoon. Whoops. But the conclusion, I think one thing that all the different stakeholders at least claimed they were aiming for was transparency and a democratic license to operate for the surveillance agencies. That the European Court of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and UK law has never said surveillance is always wrong. It's always said targeted, proportionate, necessary surveillance is essential in crime prevention, in preventing and detecting serious crime, terrorism, and so on. Unfortunately, I think, again, there's been something of a missed opportunity with the Investigatory Powers Bill, where civil society groups have said, okay, Snowden revealed this very broad interpretation of existing legal powers by GCHQ, a lot of activities that were not democratically debated, except in a very small intelligence and security committee that's been greatly criticised for its effectiveness in the past. And all the IP bill does, civil society says, is basically it legitimises all of those activities. It makes them more, it puts them more clearly into the face of the legislation, which is a positive thing. But there has not been a serious debate with all stakeholders about which of those powers were necessary and proportionate and which of them were not. It's a bit like pulling a skirt down after you've exposed your ankles. Limited public debate. That's partly because of complexity, a dominant security discourse, as has been mentioned, ongoing terrorist atrocities, of course, tend to push people in the direction of securitization. And what has been suggested was, can we go back to more citizen-centric thinking? Because the alternative is, if this investigatory powers bill passes, Britain will be a global leader in surveillance, not in the democratic license to operate that the government was hoping for. Thank you.
My name's Michael Rogers. I worked on the technology strand of this project with Grace Eden, and we looked principally at technical standards and the way they shape communication infrastructure, and the way that the social processes of standard making leave their traces on the standards and therefore on the infrastructure, and either enable or hinder surveillance. We conducted an interview study with members of 11 standards bodies, and we asked them about their attitudes to surveillance and privacy and any responses to the Snowden revelations within their organisations. These were very diverse organisations. Some of them are government institutions. There are national and international NGOs, industry consortia. There are associations of professionals in mathematics and other technical fields. And there are some organisations that almost would deny the name of organisation. They describe themselves as loosely self-organised groups of individuals. But these organisations nevertheless produce agreement on solutions to technical problems through a process of negotiation. The participants in that process each bring their own goals to the table, and those are reflected in often complex compromises. So the documents that these organisations produce tend to be extremely complex even to experts in the field, and they reflect a kind of freezing of the balance of power at a particular point between different interests in that field. So they're quite interesting documents to look at, especially as attitudes change over time. There's a long history of intelligence agencies participating in the standards making process. In the case of the NSA and GCHQ, they participate overtly as part of their role to protect national information security, but they also have a dual role as surveillance agencies. So there's always a question kind of hanging over their participation as to what it is they're trying to achieve. There's a very long history of alleged subversion of standards in order to produce systems that are vulnerable to surveillance, or some have also suggested just in order to increase the complexity of systems to the point where they're difficult to implement or where adoption is no longer attractive. So going back to the earliest civilian encryption standards in the 1970s, there's been this question of which standards can be trusted. It's always been debated, but until recently there's been very little hard evidence either way. That really changed with the Snowden leaks. Specifically, the Snowden documents described a SIGINT enabling project, that's Signals Intelligence Enabling, which has an enormous $250 million annual budget and is aimed at covertly or overtly influencing technical standards to make systems exploitable for surveillance. Two examples of this, which weren't explicitly named in the Snowden documents, but enough detail was there for people to put the pieces together, were a standard for generating random numbers for cryptography, which was standardized by 3 different standards organizations, but effectively all 3 standards were based on a design that was steered by the NSA. And the design contains a backdoor that allows the NSA specifically, as the provider of certain magic numbers in that standard, to guess encryption keys produced by systems that implement the standard. Another standard where there's evidence of subversion was an apparently inexplicable extension to an internet encryption standard that was co-authored by an NSA employee. Very little rationale was given for this, but it was just stated that we can't really tell you why, but we need this for a certain defense contractor, and will you please pass this standard? It's otherwise harmless. Turns out retrospectively that standard, although harmless on its own, would have enabled exploitation of the first backdoor that I mentioned. So that's 4 different standards bodies that were certainly targets of subversion under this project, and there may be others. We talked to participants in different standards bodies, asking them how the bodies have responded, and there was enormous variation between the organisations. I think in part that's down to different organisational cultures. As Ian mentioned, the telecoms bodies, like the telecoms companies, have a long history of cooperation with the state on surveillance matters. They often have technical standards describing exactly how that should be done. The internet bodies, on the other hand, tend to have a more individualist ethos, but a lot of them have their roots in defence research. And there are also, as I mentioned, professional associations, academic associations that sort of feed into technical standards through their research, and there a lot of the individuals go on to be recruited by agencies, and a lot of the research is funded by agencies. So those different relationships predating Snowden, I think, have tended to shape the responses to the Snowden revelations in those different organisations. I'm going to focus here on 3 organisations. We don't really have time to talk about all of them, but there are 8 more discussed in our paper. So NIST was perhaps the most sort of publicly embarrassed standards organisation when the Snowden documents came out, because they had produced this standard for random number generation. They have a long history of power struggle with the NSA, as I mentioned, going back to, well, in fact, before NIST even existed in the late 1970s, and when NIST came into being, the NSA immediately started to contest its role in developing civilian crypto standards. This embarrassment prompted them to bring in a committee of external experts to advise them on how to strengthen their standards process, and the recommendations included increasing their in-house crypto expertise, although really compared to the budget of the NSA, that's, it's almost impossible to achieve parity there. Reviewing their statutory relationship with the NSA, which so far has not happened, and using a more transparent process to develop their standards in order to increase trust. And one of the reasons actually that NIST was so embarrassed was that it was generally a very well regarded and well trusted standards organisation among technologists, because some of its standards were developed by an excellent transparent process, using a competition to choose between entrants from around the world on published criteria, avoiding a lot of the complexity and a lot of the kind of bargain striking that happens in a lot of other standardisation efforts. So it was also recommended to carry on and increase the use of competitions. One of the other bodies that I mentioned earlier on, the Internet Engineering Task Force, was the target of subversion of standards. It has a long history of supporting strong encryption, making statements about resisting surveillance, refusing to publish standards on wiretapping and lawful intercept, and the response to the Snowden revelations was very strong on a technical level. Surveillance was generally regarded as a technical problem to be solved by technical means. The document Pervasive Monitoring is an Attack was published in response to the Snowden leaks, and this essentially defined mass surveillance as something that internet standards would have to address. And new standards are in the works for widening the use of encryption. So in a sense there's a very strong response, but the response to the potential subversion within the organisation itself was much less strong. One of the leading bodies within the IETF that produces crypto advice was co-chaired by an NSA employee, and an IETF participant asked that employee be removed because of an obvious conflict of interest. That request was very quickly dismissed. There was not really any investigation of the subverted standard itself, or how that came to kind of pass so far through the standardisation process. Unlike NIST, there wasn't any kind of external review. Everything was very much handled internally and informally, as is the style of the IETF. And one of our interviewees said that this really came down to an unofficial hierarchy existing within what is supposedly a very horizontal organisation. a lot of the people who've been in the ITF for a long time have also worked for defence contractors for a long time. They know and trust each other, but they've never really had to grapple with the idea of a serious conflict of interest where somebody is trying to undermine the work of the organisation itself rather than simply having a technical disagreement or perhaps even a political disagreement about what ought to go into a standard. So there seems to be an unacknowledged power structure there, which therefore is not really being addressed. The sister organisation of the ITF, the Internet Research Task Force, was also quite strong in its response to the Snowden leaks. This is a body that considers future directions for standards, so it's kind of a long-term partner of the ITF. There were two broad changes there. Within the Crypto Forum Research Group, which, as I mentioned, was co-chaired by an NSA employee, there's been a sort of attempt to reduce the reliance on the NSA for crypto expertise, mainly by drawing on the academic crypto community, which has become somewhat more politicised post-Snowden as well. But, as I mentioned, structurally, the problem is the same as the ITF. There's a refusal to engage with the question of whether anybody might be taking part in bad faith, and so while you can try and build up an alternative base of expertise, there's not really any mechanism in place for dealing with intentional subversion. And another really interesting development that's going on within the IRTF is the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group, which I'd like to discuss more in our workshop later. This is a working group that's trying to reconcile the language of human rights with the language that's used in Internet Protocol documents and trying to bring human rights considerations explicitly into IETF standards in the same way that, for example, security considerations now have to be included in every standard. This smoking gun, as it were, pointing to subversion of standards has raised a number of questions that really remain open, and unfortunately in a lot of the standards organisations are not being addressed openly. Whether agencies with a dual role can have any role in developing standards that are only supposed to serve the role of information security and not of surveillance. Whether a transparent process is adequate to mitigate against attempts to subvert the process, how open non-hierarchical groups or groups that see themselves as horizontal and open can deal with subversion, and whether there's any way to incorporate human rights into technical standards.
Okay, great. So these were just a few snapshots of what we've been doing over the past 18 months. How to summarize that? What does all this mean for digital citizenship? We could spend another hour on this probably, but just a few thoughts by way of a conclusion. Well, there's probably enough material here from what we heard to paint a pretty grim picture. We've heard that there's insufficient public discourse. We've heard that this discourse is actually dominated by national security concerns that prioritize the state's role in protecting against physical harms over citizens' privacy and civil rights. The result for civil society is one of normalization and resignation, surveillance realism, as we've called it. While for policy reform, it means that some concerns are prioritized, others are neglected. And policy reform is geared towards, well, we could say towards enabling the state rather than enabling active digital citizens. And the very heart of technological infrastructure, standards and protocols have been weakened and compromised. So we can also observe different understandings of security here, perhaps state security on the one side, the protection from terrorism, crime, and so on, versus human security on the other side, privacy and so on. And the first understanding is, in most of what we've seen here, clearly prioritized over the second. But our research also shows that this is by no means a straightforward process. People are concerned about their privacy and the monitoring of their data, as we've heard. Journalists are critical about surveillance, and outside the classic mainstream press, critical perspectives are more widespread. Policy reform has been highly controversial and conflictive, and has uncovered actually quite fundamental differences among stakeholders. And the more open structures of technical standards development have offered promising avenues for incorporating human rights concerns in technological standards. And so overall, the Snowden revelations, well, they have crystallized the ways in which citizenship is moving towards, well, perhaps a more monitored form, in which the relations between the state and citizens are renegotiated. But that renegotiation is ongoing, it's contentious, it's very contested in some areas. It will be interesting, certainly, to see how this evolves further. Thank you for listening over this past hour. Please check our website, where we will publish our actual research results over the coming months. We will continue the debate in the workshops this afternoon, and also in a coffee break that we'll have now downstairs in the room where you registered at the beginning, for half an hour. We'll have maybe just a couple of minutes now for a few questions and comments, if there are any immediate questions and comments on anything that you've heard so far. Anything? Anyone who wants to raise a point? Yes?
I have a question about the standards making. Because I understood if you want to be involved in the making of standards, it's almost a full-time job. So many people that engage with this debate, they are people working for companies, and they are engaged with this discussion. So it's either agencies or companies. So I wondered if anybody has some kind of indication of the percentage of, let's say, people that are not having a dual role or are actually not paid to deliberate in this standard making.
I think that's a really good question, and I don't think it would be easy to answer for an organisation like the IETF, because it has this kind of dogma that everybody takes part as an individual, and you may list an affiliation on the attendance sheet, but no questions are really asked beyond that. And so I think you're absolutely right. Most of the people there are there because their time is being paid for by someone. It's a tremendously tedious and time-consuming process to be involved in, and some people may do it as a hobby, but most of the people there, they have somebody's axe to grind. But the self-image of the organisation is that it's just a bunch of people, taking part in a discussion, and because it's a discussion about technology, that's it's irrelevant who they represent, and I think that self-image needs to be questioned now, and maybe the more difficult question for the IETF, rather than how it kind of deals with intelligence agency participation, is how does it more broadly define itself as a group of individuals without recognising those individual interests.
I think it would be very interesting as well. You're giving me ideas for MSc projects for next year, because on the one hand, the IETF its process in one sense is very transparent. They try to publish everything they do online and make all their decisions through open mailing lists that anyone can join. The archives are online. But at the same time, alongside the, as part of the unofficial hierarchy, because by the way, I used to do this, I was one of those professional standards writers. In fact, the US Department of Homeland Security paid me to do it for 6 years. So, I did it before that for a long time as a PhD student also, at the IETF and the ITU and ETSI, which does mobile phone standards. As part of the unofficial hierarchy, there's a very strong technocracy/meritocracy. So if you turned up as a self-acknowledged, hobbyist or amateur would be unpleasant ways to frame it. You would be laughed at by most of the people there. I think in a very unself-aware way. As far as I understand, efforts in the past by civil society groups and by government officials to go to some of these meetings and to more strongly ask for human rights to be taken into consideration have been a very hard slog, and it took a long time to persuade the IETF to put in privacy considerations into its standards documents, and I'll be fascinated to see how far these human rights considerations get, because many computer scientists and I say this as a computer scientist, I really don't think that's something that they should be considering at all in technical standards. They would say very naive things like, oh, these are technical documents, they have nothing to do with human rights, without any thought about the huge impact, of course, as we know from Snowden and many other examples. So it would be wonderful if an unintended consequence of Snowden was that these standardization bodies became more self-aware, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
Yeah, that's one of the things that will be interesting to follow up and to look at. Right now, there is at the moment there is an ICANN meeting in Helsinki, and where there is a working group also talking about that very question about the incorporation of human rights into the standards that they set. And so, yes, one of the many topics. Lots of topics to discuss in our workshops this afternoon, our more specific meetings, I think. Let's have a cup of coffee and little bite downstairs, and then reconvene in the different more specific thematic settings.
Maybe just say where the
I can just
manufacturing room
remind
is.
people where
Yes,
what is
okay.
happening.
So where will be? First coffee downstairs in the basement, then the marble hall, not the basement, the marble hall. Important. Then we'll have a meeting on media-related issues, media coverage, challenges to journalists, and so on here in this room. The civil society and activism meeting will be upstairs, first floor in the manufacturing room. That will be for an hour, and then afterwards we'll have two more here in this room, a meeting on technology and standards, but also some tech privacy-enhancing tools and so on. While on the first floor in the manufacturing room we have a meeting about policy advocacy, and related issues about the Investigatory Powers Bill and beyond. Okay, we all know where we're going. First, let's have coffee. Thank you.